Lena adjusted the strap of her vintage bag, feeling a knot of anxiety in her stomach. She hadn't been on a date in several months. Today she was meeting Jake, a man she knew only from pleasant conversations in the store where he worked as a charming sales assistant. There was something about him that strongly attracted her, even though he wasn't like the men she had met before. Jake didn't drive a fancy car, wear designer clothes, or try to impress her with his status. During their first meeting, he mentioned that he worked odd jobs and lived in a small apartment. Lena found this refreshing as she was tired of men flaunting their wealth. Now she sat across from him in a cozy booth at a small dinner, watching as he nervously ran a hand through his slightly tousled hair. "I hope you don't mind," Jake said with a shy smile, nodding at the laminated menu. "This place isn't fine dining, but their burgers are the best in town." Lena laughed, feeling some of the tension ease. "I love places like this," she replied. "Greasy food and milkshakes. What's not to like?" A smile touched Jake's lips, and a mischievous sparkle lit up his blue eyes. "Great, because I was worried you might be expecting something fancier." She shook her head. "Not at all. Honestly, I prefer this over expensive restaurants with tiny portions." The conversation flowed easily and naturally. They discussed books, reminisced about childhood adventures, and laughed at awkward moments. Lena hadn't expected Jake to captivate her so much. He was intelligent, witty, and most importantly, he genuinely listened to her. When the check arrived, Jake reached for it, but Lena quickly covered his hand with hers. "Let me pay," she said softly. "I know things are tough for you right now. And it's no problem." His smile faltered for a moment, but then he confidently pulled out an old, worn leather wallet and handed the waitress cash. No credit cards, no fancy black cards that her exes used to flaunt. Just neatly folded bills. As they stepped outside, the air was cool and filled with the anticipation of autumn. "It's still early," Jake said, glancing at his watch. "Want to take a walk?" Lena nodded, and they strolled leisurely down the quiet streets, surrounded by the soft glow of streetlights. It felt strangely intimate. She tucked her hands into her coat pockets, stealing glances at him. "You're not like the others I've dated," she confessed. Jake raised an eyebrow. "How so?" She shrugged. "You're genuine." Something fleeting crossed his expression, but he simply nodded. "I just like keeping things simple." They walked a little further before Jake suddenly stopped beside a stylish black car parked at the curb. Lena frowned. "Is this yours?" Jake hesitated for a moment, then grinned. "Borrowed it from a friend while mine's in the shop." She looked at him more closely, feeling a pang in her chest. She smiled, easily accepting the explanation. It made sense. A guy like Jake probably couldn't afford a fancy car, and she respected that he wasn't ashamed of it. He gallantly opened the passenger door for her, and as Lena slid into the seat, something inside her stirred. This was different, this was real, and she was already falling for him. Over the next few days, they found their rhythm: morning coffee at a small cafe on the corner, walks through the city at night, and long conversations on a park bench about serious and silly things. Jake never tried to impress her with money. He chose cozy, unpretentious places: a small bakery with the best apple butter, a tiny eatery with incredible thai food, and old cinema. She appreciated his simplicity, sincerity, and the ease with which he existed beside her. It was genuine. One evening, they sat on a bench by the river watching the city lights dance on the water. Lena shivered, pulling her coat tighter. Jake noticed immediately and, without a word, took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. "You don't have to," she began. "Take it," he insisted, his voice warm but firm. Lena sighed but smiled, pulling the jacket closer. It smelled like him, said her, and something indescribably masculine. "You always take care of me," she whispered. Jake leaned back on the bench, spreading his arms wide. "When someone is important to you, that's how it should be." Her heart skipped a beat. He had said she was important to him. He really cared about her. She saw it in the little things, in how he always walked her home, remembered her favorite books, and listened to her as if every word mattered. Lena turned to him, studying his face, the sharp angles of his jaw, the play of light and shadow on his chin. "You're almost perfect, you know," she said softly. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "Far from it. I don't believe that," she murmured. Something unreadable flickered in his eyes, but then it was gone. He simply smiled, and the moment passed. "Let's go," he said, standing up and offering her his hand. "I'll take you home." Lena took his hand without hesitation, letting Jake help her to her feet. As they walked down the evening streets, one question echoed in her mind: was she falling too fast, too hard? A familiar voice made her pause. Lena turned, and her heart fluttered. Jake stood at the entrance. Dressed in his usual style, jeans and a simple, perfectly fitting shirt, exuding that same ease and confidence that always made her pulse quicken. "Hey," she greeted him, setting aside a stack of books. "What are you doing here?" Jake hesitated slightly. "I thought you might want to grab lunch." Lena glanced at the clock. "I still have an hour before my break." But before she could finish, her manager, Claudia, peeked out from behind the counter. "Lena, take your break now. It's quiet today." Lena smiled brightly. "Thanks, Claudia." Claudia winked at her, and Jake led Lena outside. Instead of heading to one of their usual spots, he walked towards the same black car parked at the curb. Lena frowned. "Is this the same car?" Jake paused briefly, then nodded. "Yeah, my friend is still letting me borrow it while mine's in the shop." She didn't ask any more questions. Jake clearly wasn't the type of person who owned such a car. But instead of going to one of their usual places, he stopped in front of an expensive restaurant with panoramic windows and a doorman. Lena raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Jake," she asked, looking at him. His expression was unreadable. "I thought we could try something new today." She hesitated. "Isn't this place a bit too expensive?" His jaw tightened briefly, but he quickly smiled. "Don't worry about it." There was something strange in his voice, something slightly off, but she said nothing and followed him inside. The restaurant was stunning, sparkling crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, tables covered in pristine white cloths, and elegantly presented dishes. Jake nodded casually, as if this environment was familiar to him. Lena sat down slowly, feeling questions swirling in her mind. Why did the maitre d' act like he knew Jake? Jake casually took the menu, seeming completely at ease. She felt a pang of uncertainty, a feeling she hadn't experienced since they first met. Carter, the waiter said, glancing briefly at the menu before setting it aside and looking at her. "Your usual selection, sir." Jake's voice was the same as always, but now there was a hint of caution in it. Lena forced a smile. "I'm just surprised. You always said you liked simplicity." A slight smile touched his lips. "I do. But that doesn't mean we can't do something special once in a while." She looked around, elegant surroundings, sophisticated guests, waiters in impeccably pressed uniforms. This was special. This was luxury. Before she could respond, the waiter placed a bottle of wine on the table. "Your usual choice, sir," he said, filling 2 glasses before disappearing, leaving an awkward silence. Lena took a deep breath. "Jake, how do they know you here?" His fingers tapped lightly on the table, his jaw tightening again. "I come here sometimes." Lena leaned forward, her voice softer but firmer. "You said your car was in the shop, that you worked odd jobs." "You said." Jake sighed heavily and leaned back. "I never said I was struggling." "Lena, that was your assumption." Her heart sank. "Because you let me believe it." Something unreadable flickered in his blue eyes. "Would you have given me a chance if you'd known the truth?" She opened her mouth but couldn't respond immediately. Her heart was racing. Jake picked up his glass, thoughtfully swirling the dark red wine. "And He paused, his expression becoming unreadable. "I didn't want to be just another rich guy trying to impress you." Lena felt a tremor inside her. So you were testing me? He pressed his lips together. It wasn't a test. I just wanted to feel normal, if only for a little while. She exhaled slowly, shifting in her seat. Full name, Jake Carter. My family owns Carter Enterprises. Lena felt the air rush out of her lungs. Carter Enterprises was everywhere: real estate, luxury hotels, private investments. It wasn't just wealth, it was power. She shook her head, looking at him intently. Nothing about what I feel for you was a lie. I meant every word. Every moment we spent together was real. Her throat tightened. But you weren't. His eyebrows furrowed slightly. Lena, she abruptly pushed her chair back and stood up. I need some air. Jake immediately stood as well. Let me take you home. No, her voice came out sharper than intended, but her emotions were in turmoil. I just need to think. The pain in Jake's eyes was fleeting, quickly hidden behind his usual composure. Okay, he said softly. Lena turned and walked away, her heart pounding with each step. She didn't stop until she was outside, the cool night air hitting her like a cold shower. Jake Carter, a millionaire. She had fallen for a man she thought she understood. But now she wasn't so sure she knew him at all. 3 days passed, 3 agonizingly long days, as Lena tried to sort through the storm of emotions inside her: pain, confusion, longing. She missed him, missed his laughter, missed the way he listened to her as if she were the most interesting person in the world. She missed the way he always took care of her, making her feel safe and cherished. But every time she remembered what he had hidden from her, a wave of resentment washed over her. She wasn't angry that he was rich. She was angry that he hadn't trusted her. A soft knock at the door startled her. Lena froze, her heart racing. She hesitated for only a moment before opening the door. Jake stood on the threshold, as devastatingly handsome as ever, but different. The usual confidence in his eyes was replaced by something vulnerable, almost defenseless. Hey, he said, his voice husky. Hey, she replied softly. For a moment, they stood in heavy silence, filled with all the things they hadn't said yet. Finally, Jake exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I know I should have told you the truth sooner. I should have trusted you. I hate that I hurt you. Lena crossed her arms, studying his face intently. Why didn't you tell me? His jaw tightened. Because I know what happens when people find out who I am. Everything changes. They see my name, my bank account, but not me. He shook his head. But you looked at me like I was just a regular guy. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could just be myself. Now she understood. It wasn't about deceit, it was about fear. Fear of being seen only through the lens of his wealth. Jake took a step closer, his voice lower and warmer. But I should have trusted you, Lena. And I'm sorry. Her throat tightened. I never cared about your money, Jake. I know that. His blue eyes darkened with emotion. And that's why I fell in love with you. Those words struck her like a lightning bolt. In love. Jake slowly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small worn book. I read it, he confessed, awkwardly scratching the back of his neck. I wanted to understand what you liked, how you saw the world. Her breath caught. He had read her favorite book just to be closer to her. His touch was warm and confident. I know I made a mistake. But if you let me, I want to show you who I really am. He paused, his voice barely a whisper. Not Jake Carter, the millionaire. Just a man who is madly, hopelessly in love with you. Her heart ached with the weight of everything they had been through, the love, the fear, the beautiful, terrifying truth. And in the next moment, the walls she had built around her heart crumbled. She buried her face in his chest, inhaling his familiar scent. Jake exhaled sharply, pulling her closer, as if afraid she might disappear. I missed you, she whispered. His arms tightened around her, almost painfully. God, Lena, I missed you too. She pulled back, looking into his eyes. No more secrets. Jake held her gaze steadily, his voice firm and confident. No more secrets. Lena smiled slowly. Okay. And then he kissed her. It wasn't a cautious or tentative kiss, it was deep and hungry, filled with all the things they hadn't said to each other: love, desire, promise. It was real. When their lips finally parted, Jake, still breathing heavily, pressed his forehead against hers. "Come with me," he said softly. Her heart skipped a beat. "Where?" He intertwined their fingers. "Anywhere." And in that moment, she knew her place was by his side. Lena sat in the passenger seat of his car, their fingers still entwined. The tension of the past few days melted away, leaving a sense of lightness and warm certainty. Jake glanced at her, a playful gleam in his eyes. "You're quiet," he noted. She smiled. "Just thinking about good things." He grinned but didn't press further. Instead, he simply squeezed her hand, returning his attention to the road. A few minutes later, he parked in front of a tall building glowing with soft light. It was an understated yet impeccably luxurious residential complex. Lena frowned. "Jake, where are we?" He turned off the engine and faced her. "My place." Her heart skipped a beat. She had never been there before. Jake noticed her hesitation and gently traced his finger over her knuckles. "I want you to see my world. The real one." Lena swallowed and nodded. The elevator ascended silently, the tension between them charged with something different. When the doors opened, they stepped directly into his penthouse. Lena paused, taking in the view. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city skyline like a sparkling ocean of lights, a modern yet cozy interior, warm lighting, and shelves filled with books. "I know it seems big," Jake said, nodding. "But it's never felt like home." Lena turned to him, hearing something in his voice that made her heart ache. He took a deep breath, looking down. "I've spent too long convincing myself that I didn't need anyone, that being alone was strength. But then I met you, and I realized that loneliness is just emptiness." Her chest tightened, and she stepped closer, placing her hands on his chest. "Jake," he looked up, his eyes filled with vulnerability. "I mean it. I want you here." Lena's heart raced as she saw the raw emotion in his eyes. "Stay," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Stay with me. As long as you want." Her breath caught, and she reached up, cupping his cheek. "Okay." Jake exhaled as if he had been holding his breath, then pulled her into a deep, slow kiss, sealing their promise. When Lena woke up the next morning, the first thing she saw was his face. "Morning," he murmured softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She smiled. "Morning." He leaned down, kissing her forehead. "I could get used to this." Lena traced a finger down his chest. "Me too." His expression became serious. "I meant what I said yesterday. No more secrets. Ever." She looked into his eyes and saw only sincerity. "Okay. Because I'm with you." Jake smiled slowly, a genuine and heartfelt smile. "Yes." He pulled her closer, and their lips met again. "So let's build something real together." And Lena knew they already had.